I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Michael, Chief Research Officer, guides the practice's research agenda and architecture by leveraging his extensive experience to identify and unlock emerging trends. Jimit, Partner, leads Everest Group's research offerings focused on an enterprise executives in IT, sourcing and vendor management, and shared services. Ashwin, Vice President, leads Everest Group's practice focused on serving enterprise IT leaders. Ashwin is responsible for developing Everest Group's research offerings focused on CIOs, CDOs, CTOs, CISOs, and IT strategy heads across application, cloud and infrastructure, data, and security services. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Michael.
Thank you, Joshua. So I'm beaming in from the plains of Texas, just north of Dallas, and I want to welcome everybody to the session. As we get started here, I wanted to, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about some of the latest research we've had gathered from our stakeholders in the IT enterprise. And so we're going to show you some of the data we've gotten, and we're going to show you some of our thoughts for that, and then we'll take you there. But let's start with something a little fun here. Let's lighten the mood, and let's just get your perspectives on where we're starting the year. And so what we're going to do is open up a quick poll here, just asking for a sentiment question. How are you feeling about 2021? So Kiara, if you could open up that poll, that'd be great. So how are you feeling about 2021? Is it going to be you feeling worse than 2020? Or you think it's going to be about the same? You think it's going to be a bad half, first half, optimistic about the second half? Or I guess we could say I already had COVID or the vaccine, so nothing can stop me now. Let's just move on. Let's start having fun. Okay, the answers are coming in here. And it's pretty similar to another poll we did on the same topic here a few weeks back. Pretty much the same distribution here. So let's close that poll. And what you're going to see there is the results. And so I guess everybody does have that feeling. We got a little bit more of a storm to come, but feeling pretty optimistic about the second half. I see several folks have gone for about the same as 2020, but the overwhelming majority here is feeling optimistic about second half. And I think that's kind of the sentiment that you're going to see from us in this presentation. It certainly was a rough 2020, but as we get closer to solutions for solving the COVID-19 pandemic part of it, then we can move on to our business as usual. So let's get started with the content. And I'm going to churn that over to Jimit. And Jimit, let's just talk about your perspectives here.
Sure. So greetings, everyone. I am in cold New York City. It's sunny out, but full of snow. So I think for a number of you, and I see quite a few familiar names in the attendee list, you'll have heard me speak about how to drive optimization in IT. You need to think about transforming the entire operating model, right? And what we mean by that is we've seen a shift away from a mindset which said, let's think of IT in terms of people, process, technology, to an 8-dimension atom, as we like to think of it, which looks at strategy as well as solution dimensions. So you need to be thinking about transforming the IT operating model across elements of strategy, which are the items in orange. So vision, economics, org and culture, performance. And then also elements of solution, which is where you see the flavors of technology, talent, sourcing, and innovation and process, right? So as we've seen organizations take this approach to transforming IT, you see some breakthrough results, which we'll show you on the right-hand side of the screen, which is you move from the initial state to the transformed state, which enables a greater than 30% cost takeout over 2 to 3 years. And as we'll unpack over the course of this webinar, cost savings is a big priority for IT organizations. So you get that 30% savings while achieving productivity improvements as well as enhanced business value. We call this the genius of the and. You're no longer making trade-offs, but you're getting both savings as well as improvements and business value. So that's the foundation with which we wanted to set the stage and keep going. Michael?
So Jimmy, we're not saying IT budgets are going down by 30%. We're just saying that money is being reallocated within the organization.
Absolutely. We're gonna show how in a few minutes.
Absolutely. All right, fantastic. All right, so what we're going to do is we've broken the presentation down into 3 sections. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the context setting for the overall enterprise. Then we'll jump into the detail about the actual IT cost savings we see. And then we're going to show you 2 real life case examples that we worked with clients on over the last few months here. And then we'll take some Q&A. So with that, let's just jump into what we're seeing for 2021 at the enterprise level. And so, let's just jump right into the content there. So let's talk about what we entered 2020 with. And our theme last year, exactly a year ago, was 2020 is going to be a year of uncertainty. And I pulled the page out here that we used there. We were talking about, the uncertainty of policy via Twitter. I think that one's largely been put to rest. We had some weakening manufacturing growth. We had the US-European elections. Those are over now. But the geopolitical issues that we had with Brexit and NATO and US-China trade were all in the news. The one thing that we did not have in the plan for uncertainty was obviously what we all experienced, COVID-19. And so that brought on a very different level of uncertainty. As we look at things, indicators like the stock market, we look at indicators about some of the unemployment numbers getting better. It certainly was a rough first half of last year, but it's amazing how businesses have come roaring back in not every industry. I mean, we all know there are certain industries that are still on hold, especially travel and entertainment. But many industries have used this crisis as a way to accelerate their overall business transformation. So if we look at those specific business model changes that organizations were looking to make in the upcoming year in 2021, certainly the need to drive operational efficiency and resilience, especially on that last half, the resilience has really been emphasized, and our eyes have been opened to the need for doing that. I would say we plan for disasters in terms of locations and weather events and buildings going down, even cities going down, but I don't think we ever planned on a global pandemic. And I've been in this industry for 3+ decades, and I can assure you that nobody said, hey, the world's going to go down or go into a different operating pattern, if you will, within a matter of weeks. But the next 2 you see are related to customer. And so the customer experience, we talk about digital customer experience and driving customer acquisition, the top 2 out of 3 business model changes.
And as we think about it in the context of what's IT grappling with, thinking about 2021 from our key issues study that Michael just referenced at a macro level, the single most important priority for CIOs right now is how do you really do more with the same, right? So managing budgetary constraints is the primary significant challenge, with half the organization saying that that's a big issue. Not far behind is the imperative to create the right workforce. People are dealing with this whole thesis of distributed IT. So how do you really have the right locations, the right roles, the right skills to be able to do more with less? Associated with that, the third and fourth, which was a tie, how do you drive more productivity in a distributed IT environment? And then how do you deal with data privacy and cybersecurity issues, right? So our research in some ways is looking forward. As we look at the agenda for the year, we're looking across these 4 imperatives. But today's discussion and today's webinar was going to be all about the first one, which is how do you really manage some of these budgetary constraints?
Okay, so let's drop into the detail. We're going to show you the IT specific research, and we're going to start that off with a conversation. We're going to, Ashwin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. And we just wanted to elaborate on the kind of outlook that we see for enterprise IT spend. So Michael alluded to some of the optimism that we are starting to see, and a part of that is translating into the IT spend outlook that we see. However, layered with what I would say a veneer of caution, if you will. So the net message is that on an average, IT spend is expected to stay consistent in terms of what we saw entering 2020 versus what we are observing as we have entered 2021. So if you really think back at 2020, the second and the third quarters, there was understandably a dip or a freeze in terms of IT spend. Many projects were taken, were taken off. There were genuinely austerity measures put in place. So there is good news, which is we see a recovery from the dip back to the normal levels. But the not so good news is that eventually 2 out of 3 IT leaders, and if you look at some of the survey data that we have on the left, so 2 in 3 IT leaders are pretty much left with the same levels of IT budget to expend as they had at the start of 2020, right? So in some ways, they are actually walking the IT tightrope, if you will. So it's become a delicate balancing act between driving efficiencies, dealing with cost takeout on the one hand, but keeping an eye on driving innovation and transformation initiatives to support business objectives. And in some ways, we see this pattern to be uniform across different key geographies as well. You'll see that some of the numbers seem to be a bit more optimistic in Europe. A part of this is, we believe, is because when you think of Europe as a region, there are certain geographies, certain verticals, which have typically been laggards in terms of spend, especially from a digital transformation context. And some of that, is now turning into net new investments as they try to become digital first as well. Now,
When I look at this, Ashwin, I see the nearly flat does represent the biggest bar on the chart, but there are a number of organizations in there that are looking to spend more. So, I mean, it's, there's a good 25% over in that moderate to significant growth.
Sure, Michael, and some of that, as you alluded earlier, has industry nuance as well in terms of who has recovered well and who's still, still there to cover ground, if you will. And as we think of IT spend from an internal enterprise context, on the next slide, we've established that there's a flatlining, or there's a balance in terms of a stability in terms of the spend that we see. But there are certain aspects of IT which are seeing a flip in terms of the spend allocation versus the others. So what you see on the left side here is that if you think of the allocation of budgets over the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen more budgets or a higher proportion being allocated to the applications estate, and especially the build part or the develop part of of the application services domain. Now, and in some ways, this is intuitive in the sense that enterprises are trying to build applications, roll out features, functionalities as they try to build digital touch points with their customers, with their partners, and so on and so forth, right? So consequently, the app intensity is increasing, and so is the spend. Some of the other key elements, right? If you look at the bottom, cloud. So if you really think of it, the trifecta of benefits that cloud brings in, which is cost effectiveness, resilience, and business agility, some ways that story is starting to unfold. And we're seeing a lot of fence sitters, if you will, who are really grappling with the decision on cloud, whether to go in there. Are there issues around variability, security? All of that has been put aside, and enterprises are now taking the plunge across industries, right? So that's a huge spend theme at this point in time. Businesses have been going remote and digital. So needless to say, a lot of software to enable remote working, collaboration, virtual ways of doing business has led to increase in enterprise software spend. Security, of course, proliferated touch points. So there are buckets within security that are definitely seen a fillip. It's really user touching aspects like identity and access management, MDR, and so on and so forth. And data and analytics and automation and AI, this pretty much correlates to the point Michael mentioned around customer experience and customer acquisition. Obviously, data platforms are also getting modernized and moving a lot to the cloud. Now, this means that there is a countervailing force where there has to be a decrease in spend, and infrastructure is one area where a lot of optimization has been driven. So in some ways, the run function within IT, enterprise IT, be it application or infrastructure managed services, is where a lot of optimization is being driven. And of course, there's an added element around reducing capex in hardware and devices, and some of the operating expenses that go into telecom, right? So that's in some way how the balance has been maintained. So we alluded to this even in our previous webinar where we talked about the future of the IT operating model. Now, as a result of this, what we are seeing is enterprises are really setting some lofty and aggressive goals in terms of the cost takeout that they want to achieve. So if we move on, we've given some examples that you'll see on the left-hand side. These are some real-life examples that we're seeing in terms of the targets that enterprise IT leaders have said that they want to achieve. Jimit talked about the 30% cost takeout from the run baseline, which we believe is achievable. Another example, I talked about the application estate, and then really forward-looking enterprises are trying to do away with the run skew that they have within the portfolio and ensure that more than 50% of that spend is actually going into the build part that's enabling business, right? So that's another example. End user compute is very interesting, right? So there has been an increase in investments in terms of remote working solutions, collaboration, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, the end user support function has realized that this is the time when they can really look at their operating model, drive a lot of productivity, drive a lot of efficiencies in the way in which end users are supported, drive analytics to really reduce effort for support. And the net effect is overall, if you think of workplace services heads or end user compute heads, they're really looking to minimize overall TCO per user as they think about their environment, right? Now, in terms of achieving these targets, clearly enterprises in some ways are grappling with what is a practical target that they need to set for themselves. In certain cases, they're looking to benchmark themselves and calibrate versus what their peers are doing in the industry to really get their heads around what a plausible target really looks like. And in our experience, one of the key elements that comes into play here is the context within which you are setting these targets and you are really formulating the transformation roadmap, right? Each enterprise is different. We think of them as snowflakes. There are idiosyncrasies that are going to come into play. And as you think of that, there are 5 key elements of context that we have laid out on the right. So you can read them, but I'll illustrate this with a couple of examples. If you think of industry and nature of operations as an example, right? And we'll talk about cloud as a key theme for cost takeout. The question becomes, what moves to the cloud? Are there devices and applications that are really tied to legacy systems? That are there regulatory implications around that? We've seen some very niche examples. For instance, in certain geographies, there are utilities companies which get tax rebates based on the infrastructure investments that they make. So, and in some cases, this kind of optimizes the options that are there to really move to the cloud, right? So so the context of industry, the personas that you really need to serve comes into play over there. If you think of maturity, right? So again, it's all of this tends to be a risk versus target trade-off. So it's really important to understand what your starting point is, so that you ensure that you set targets which are lesser than what you could potentially achieve, or in certain cases, maybe a little too aggressive, right? It's also about where your business is headed. Now, there are distressed industries where cost takeout is the primary view. And in some cases, IT needs to run a parallel mandate. Some of the transformation initiatives need to be put on hold from a digital standpoint. And it's really about modernization for cost takeout. And you need to support your business with that. Versus if your business is really placed well, it's all about enablement through new features and functionalities. And then a final example, right? I'll pick the 4th point here, which is around organizational synergies. What we see in many cases is enterprises undertake transformation initiatives, but the organizational structure, right? The synergies between, say, the apps or the infra teams, as an example, really becomes a delimiter in terms of what can and cannot be achieved. So the net message here is that there is no one set of answers for all enterprises across different industries, different sizes, or say different geographies. Context is important when you think of building the transformation roadmap. And with that message, I'll hand this over to Michael, who has something interesting for the audience.
Yeah, so Everest Group is all about the metrics and the data. So we invite you. One of the best way that we find to work with clients is let them test our data. And so what we're going to do is we're going to open up a quick poll here where you have an opportunity to ask us for more detail. And again, we focus on IT services. So if you're interested in benchmarking type data and a conversation with Ashwin and Jamit, just go ahead and click the button here and pick the two areas that you're interested in learning more about. And we'd be happy to get back with you in the next week or so. So I'll leave that open here for another 5 seconds. And as people show their interest there, we can make sure we get back to you with this. And this is for enterprises. So, all right, thank you. And we'll reach out to you. And if there's any questions you have along the way, we'll try to get those as well. All right, so Jamit, let's get into the how part of the conversation. And you're going to take us through some of the case or some of the how-to aspects of what we've been seeing here in the next section.
Yep, and I think it's a part which tries to make it real, right? So as we think about the dimensions of where the savings come from, right? Let's skip over to the next slide, please. Yeah. So again, the traditional approach to thinking about cost savings in IT is to take a tower view, right? And I think that's important because it identifies certain spend categories which are across the board. So you've got 4 broad towers across infrastructure, applications, data, and security, right? I think what's happened traditionally is that the first block, which was infrastructure, had the most spend, right? And that one component is coming down. And what you're seeing is applications, data, and security are benefiting from some of the savings there. So what are the key levers that we see underneath these 4 towers, which allow us to get savings, right? First one, and these are cross-cutting because we see them as having impact across the four pillars. There's a pretty massive modernization wave, right? And so you'll see a lot of cloud-oriented implementations and optimization, which impacts not just the infrastructure, but also your applications estate, which then streamlines how you think of data and security gets harmonized. The second one, and this has been, we've had a bit of I'd call a 180 in terms of how enterprises are thinking of offshoring in the last 12 months. There was a thesis that, hey, we probably maxed out in terms of how much we could offshore. But as I reflect back on the conversations, those targets have been significantly upped as people have thought about the ability to drive distributed delivery. And then automation and process improvement, I think that's been, again, around for a while and keeps driving incremental improvement across the entire stack, right? So that's the way to kind of look at it from a traditional tower standpoint. Another lens to think about savings is as you think of the different service elements, because a large portion, roughly 70% of the spend today, is related to the service delivery and not so much within the hardware and software stack. So what are we seeing people do when it comes to internal services? There's a lot of delivery rebalancing and restructuring. Who do we hire? Who do we reskill? How do we size and shape the pyramid? That's going on. Related to offshoring, there's a pretty significant wave to set up their own global in-house centers or captives in offshore locations. When it comes to external services, you see that there's, again, a lot of activity. So RFP activity in terms of working with suppliers, probably at an all-time high. And at the same time, people are also trying to get better rates and move to more evolved models like managed services. And then there's ongoing work across the estate to drive rationalization across the hardware, tools, and applications estate to drive simplification, right? So there's a variety of levers that we see. What we wanted to talk about and quantify was the actual impact of some of these levers in isolation as well as combined. So as we move to the next slide, right? These are there's 4 or 5 different levers that we're going to talk about in today's discussion, right? The first one, and we've ranked these in order of impact that you get. So we've got 4 levers on this slide. We've called out the ranges of what we are seeing in terms of the TCO impact. More importantly, we're also seeing what's the time to value as well as risk, right? So if you look at price renegotiation, that's like step one of where people are starting anytime you have an external footprint, which is meaningful. And here we are seeing people get between 5 to 15% in-year savings through rates and rebates, right? The time to value on this is low, the risk is low, right? One of the risks that gets called out is, hey, what happens to quality if we go too low? But part of, I think, what we're also observing here is that we're seeing a bit of a reset in the actual prices when it comes to outsourced services. The next lever is automation and process improvement. This gives you 15 to 30% savings, especially if it's in conjunction with something like a cloud transformation, right? And that's one where we're seeing, the time to value is not immediate. It does take some amount of ramp time, and the risk to the business is somewhat moderated. The next big lever, again, is when you start thinking about managed services in an external context. We've had clients who've been able to take out 30% of their run cost, right? But we've seen ranges between 25 to 40%. The savings are fairly immediate, but at the same time, the risk to the operating model becomes higher, right? And then finally, and this is where we're seeing, just go back and look at the growth we've seen with the hyperscalers, the Amazons, Azures of the world. The whole cloud and estate rationalization is where enterprises are moving from pilot to programs, and that allows them to save anything between 20 to 30% in costs. And typical, we've seen examples of going up as high as 45%. That is a journey. So you're not going to get all of these savings in year. However, the risk obviously is also high from an operational standpoint. Final slide is.
So Jumit, let me just jump in here for a second. So these are some pretty big numbers when you put them in the context of the overall IT budget being nearly flat. It's surprisingly how high these numbers are, which also allows you to start thinking about how you can use that money to drive those business model changes we talked about from the enterprise level.
No, I think Michael, that's exactly the point I was trying to clarify. These are not mutually exclusive, right? If you add these all together, you have negative IT budgets. That's on the point. Most of these happen in conjunction, so you're trying to pull these levers. But what's effectively happening is this is the run part of the organization, and you're taking all of these savings to feed the build part of IT, which is what's helping drive strategic differentiation, the customer experience dimensions you mentioned right up front. So if you go back to the first three priorities, operational effectiveness, as well as driving customer experiences, all of these savings are being reinvested to drive those.
So you get that calm across the surface and a lot of opportunity for activity below the surface.
Absolutely. Lots of activity below the surface. Okay, so with that, Ashwin, back to you.
Yeah, and as we think of driving these IT cost optimization initiatives, right? So there are a couple of prerequisites that we have seen are important to keep in mind. I just wanted to highlight them. So the first one is around basically having visibility into what you want to optimize, right? And in our observations, what we've seen is that many a times there are a lot of cost elements that are missed out because of a variety of reasons, right? One, there's a proliferation in terms of the pockets within enterprises where the IT spend really comes from. It could be from different functions. It could be from the facilities organization. So a clear central visibility of IT costs becomes really difficult. And at the same time, when you think of IT estate visibility, there's a second aspect which is also around what's your talent inventory really looking like, and how does that shape up in future to support these transformation initiatives. So in some ways, we have quoted Peter Drucker over here saying, you can't manage what you can't measure. And we call, in some ways, we build this Maslow's hierarchy of IT estate visibility. So if you really look at it, it's 3 tiers. Some of the organizations are typically unorganized, where the IT, finance, or HR team simply cannot conjure up what the overall spend or the overall headcount looks like. Now, this is few and far in between, but we see this happen. A majority of organizations in our view lie in what we call as the semi-organized maturity level, where there are pockets of visibility. Individual units think that they're doing a pretty efficient job in terms of managing and budgeting their costs, or in parallel driving some of that talent to support some of this. But the truth is, when you try to aggregate all of this at the enterprise level, there are too many gaps. There is too much opaqueness that gets built into what the baseline is, and consequently, there are areas of cost leakage and value leakage eventually. So the nirvana state is the organized state. That's where you want to be, so that in some ways the opportunities manifest themselves in terms of where and what you can optimize. So that's prerequisite number one. The other is in terms of a rejig in terms of the philosophy with which budgeting is done. So if you look at the next slide, what has happened is traditionally, a lot of IT budgeting has been an annual exercise. So in many ways, there are budgets that are allocated at the start of the year for specific projects, for specific initiatives. It's locked and loaded, and then a lot of that is not revisited over the entire year. Now, in a world where now businesses are more dynamic, and then priorities are changing, especially in a post-COVID world, some of this needs to be revisited. So what we are advocating is a more flexible approach to be taken to budgeting exercises. There are a few tenets that we have mentioned over here. So we see many mature organizations going back to the theme of zero-based budgeting, where previous assumptions are completely scrapped and new, fresh allocations are happening based on initiatives that bring most value to the business, right? And as you do this, the funds automatically get allocated to initiatives that feed the top business priorities. Now, obviously, there'll be a certain baseline that can be kept out of it, but a large part of the spend, follows a very agile-based budgeting mechanism. And as you do this, there's a third element which is around the frequency with which the calibration happens. So what we are seeing is enterprises take a more regular cadence. So these could be quarterly calibrations, where each of the initiatives is checked in terms of whether it is delivering the expected business outcome. Else there is a rejig and a rebalancing that happens amongst the initiatives, right? And in certain cases, these projects could have a fixed plus variable kind of a mechanism. So there's a baseline perpetual funding that happens, and beyond that, it's capacity based, which is again linked to business outcomes. And then finally, one interesting trend that we have seen come up is innovative sources of a funding. So you're not alone in this. You have partners with the right levels of balance sheets to really come and help fund some of this transformation. Technology partners, hyperscalers, and in some cases even academia coming in and helping with some of the R&D initiatives that are co-funded and undertaken by enterprise IT. So these are a couple of points that you need to keep in mind. And with that, we'll delve a little deeper into each of the levers that Jimit mentioned. So Jimit, over to you to take up the outsourcing one first.
Yeah, so let's make sure you have a good baseline of your budgets and don't keep archaic ways of budgeting processes if you want this to work. So those are the two prerequisites that we want to talk about. What I'm going to do over the next couple of minutes is talk through how you can drive some of these savings in your external services world, right? And there's a incremental answer, and then there's a bigger answer. So the incremental answer, low-hanging fruit, lots of activity in this. How do you really address the cost leakage in your third-party relationships, right? And we've got a webinar coming up on how you move to outcome-based pricing models. So we're seeing a lot of activity within that. But what a lot of companies have done is addressed the benchmarks to make sure that they're not overpaying. At the same time, what they're also doing is revisiting the skills premium that they might be paying for some areas which are now considered commodity, right? So lots of activity going on here. Time to value is quick, risks are low. Some of the considerations here, again, you don't want to be the client that pays the least to the suppliers. So don't peg yourself to the 20th percentile unless you know your volumes are massive, right? Because then quality suffers. You want to make sure that you're reevaluating the existing pricing models So is it just time and materials based, or are you trying to move towards more pod-based structures, reviewing the offshore? And then make sure you have a great baseline when it comes to the talent side of this as well. Because most people, as Michael calls out, focus on the price, not necessarily the quantity. So making sure that you re-examine both price and quantity are key to getting between 5 to 15% savings on your external spend just through renegotiations.
Yeah, and Jamit, I always like to focus. Service providers will talk about the hot skills and want to charge a premium, but they never come back to you later and say, "Hey, those are just warm or cold skills now, and we're going to drop the price by 15, 20, 30%." So,
I mean, that's a good point, right? You see RPA in there, right? So RPA, yes, it's hot, but not as hot as it used to be. So you've seen those premiums come down, and that's what's driving. There's a lot of activity. So don't leave money on the table through that.
Yep.
If you wanted to do something a bit more evolved when it comes to the savings stack on the IT spend for external, we have a couple of additional examples as we move to the next slide. We spoke about managed services. There's two flavors I wanted to call out. And again, true value starts to get unlocked when you combine some of these levers, right? So in the first in the first scenario, which is the top half of your screen, you combine offshoring with automation, with price renegotiations and managed services to try to get a scale of activity where you're bundling run services across app ops and infra ops, reducing the proliferation to just one or two vendors, which gives you year one savings of 25 to 30%. Year 5 savings of up to 50% on that estate, right? And this is live deal scenarios that we've seen in the last 3 months alone, right? So very effective strategy. Managed services works, remote transitions work, and you can get some real in-year savings through financial engineering with run savings up to 50% on the baseline. The second scenario, again, this one is for the brave. It's called IT as a service, where if you have the charter to move to cloud, let's throw in an ERP modernization initiative with it, right? And all of the other elements we spoke about for managed services, we call these full stack IT as a service deals, where instead of thinking of certain cost elements as CapEx, you're allowing them to move to an OpEx model. And we've seen situations where, as opposed to buying the cloud platform from Azure, having a deal with SAP for the ERP upgrade and the associated systems integration services, you're now working with just the systems integrator who's buying the license for SAP on their books, buying the cloud consumption through their books, and you're getting a single invoice on a flatline basis, amortized over 5 years, right? The CFOs love this. Highly complex, but you can get some real breakthrough savings by going down this route. So the managed service philosophy when it comes to your external estate, proving to be a big driver of savings. We're seeing this in some large capital intensive industries, oil and gas, resources, mining. And it does require a lot of joint solution design and baselining, but there's some real savings to be had here. So that's on the external side. If we keep going and look through some of the additional ones, Ashwin, do you want to talk about? Yeah, let's talk about how we're seeing savings on the cloud stack.
Sure. So obviously, as we think of enterprises, many of them are already on their cloud journey at the end of the day, right? And there have been hits and misses. There have been certain cases where cost targets have been met, and in certain cases they have not. And that has consequently resulted in either repatriation in some cases, or a relook or a reset of projects in other cases, right? But fundamentally, if you really look at it, the headline message is, as you think of cloud, we kind of see it as two parts. One is the journey to the cloud, and then one, the journey in the cloud. And the success or failure with cost optimization depends on getting both right at the end of the day, right? So on the one hand, you need to ensure that the right simulation happens in terms of assessing which applications should go to which kind of models, What does the construct look like in terms of the treatment of applications and so on and so forth. So all of that business casing becomes really important. And we have seen cases where clients have not gotten this right, or enterprises have not gotten this right. There's been a significant outlay in terms of additional costs, right? But you get it right, you start hitting some of the 25 to 45% numbers that we talk about. The second part, which is more interesting, and it's really on the ground, given clients have already moved a lot, some of their workloads to the cloud, is the journey in the cloud. So how do you optimize the ongoing costs part of it? And again, there are the multiple elements to this, right? If you look at the considerations on the right, firstly, whether IT is truly able to work as a broker, where individual silos of adoption, say for instance, there are AWS instances picked up by businesses all over the place, whether IT can be the true guardian of all of that, drive economies of scale and discounts, and then broker it to individual businesses. That helps drive a lot of costs, right? The second is obviously a key area where we see 15 to 20% spend reduction in your cloud bills, which is just optimizing the ongoing spend by using the right tools, right? So using reserved instances, using the right automated policies so that VMs are switched on and switched off and they're not running unnecessarily, right? It's a huge saving and still a huge amiss when we see a lot of enterprise environments. And then as you think of cloud, there's a parallel transformation track that needs to be kept in mind, which is associated with networks. So a lot of cases, cloud transformation is done on traditional network underlays, which leads to a lot of challenges around performance, cost, and so on and so forth. The one final point around cloud here is also the focus on skills that we have been talking about previously as well. So it requires the right reskilling strategy and the right people to be working on this. So you cannot just have an AWS administrator anymore. He or she needs to understand the implications on security and network and all the adjacencies. So that becomes an additional but an important factor as you think of really achieving this 25 to 40% from a cloud standpoint. So that's on cloud. And the one final aspect that we also wanted to talk about, which has a huge bearing in terms of all the levers that we talked about, is how do you fundamentally reshape and restructure your delivery organization? And this is what we call as shifting right on talent. And there are multiple tenets to this, as you see on this particular illustration that we have. So there's a pyramid angle in terms of whether you have the right experienced set of folks. Is there too much bloating on the lower levels, or you are able to optimize by adopting cloud, automation, and all the levers that we talked about? That helps you really flatten the pyramid and drive some of the savings. Jim had talked about the onshoring versus offshoring debate. We really see stuff like distributed agile and location independent agile being talked about. So the existing assumptions around the amount of onshore resources that you need to really drive transformation is now under the scanner again, right? That's an important lever.
So Ashwin, let me just jump in there for a second. So what that's the when you had the COVID work from home, that really illustrated the need to really take something like an agile development capability and really move that into a virtual world instead of just a physical world. I mean, I think people are largely thinking, agile and scrums and teams and stuff like that were going to be physical, but we've been forced to a new model there.
Yeah, and interestingly, Michael, given that we have made that shift, it's opened up new avenues of talent that we couldn't have tapped earlier because we were thinking too onshore.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's forced us into a new model, which also has a cost savings opportunity there because you can move it to a low cost model where we prove that you can be anywhere to do most of this work.
Absolutely. Yeah. Another key talking point, which is around productivity, right? So what we saw is in the initial days of working from home, enterprises were reporting increased productivity because there was focus, but then we had a lot of fatigue set in. A lot of the productivity numbers that were getting tracked, they started going downhill. As we went months into the into the pandemic, right? And as you think of productivity, again, there are multiple levers. It's about choosing the right metrics to track productivity in some sense. So if you think of it, the metrics can be around the volume of delivery, the velocity of delivery, the quality, and so on and so forth. And it's also about some of the software aspects in terms of how do you drive collaboration, change management. So the multiple levers that come in, but we see productivity as a huge theme where enterprises can and it should be focusing on to drive both costs on one side, but also the value that is delivered to business. And of course, as we do all of this, the option of outsourcing to third-party vendors is just always on the cards. Jim had talked about some of the managed services constructs, that are in play at this point in time. Jim, anything you want to add based on your recent experiences, if at all?
No, I think all of this resonates. The one thing that I want to emphasize is the lower left. Think about productivity, defining the metrics, and then challenging the team in terms of, okay, how many story points per sprint is an ideal for your organization? And as people have looked at the benchmarks, there's been 2x impact, across the board. And let's maybe look at that through an example here, which is to make some of these levers come to life. And I think some work that we did with a client on the application stack recently was interesting. So if we move to slide 20, whatever the next slide is, yeah. Is this cost optimization study on application? So here was a client situation. We were, in some ways, they wanted to move their supply base from 100 providers to 3, right? Transition away from a capacity model to managed services. Transform the retained organization, right? Can the slide come back, please? Yeah, thank you. So rationalizing the supply base, transition from capacity to managed service, and then transform the retained organization, right? So there was an element of outsourcing, there was an element of model change, there was an element of the workforce strategy. And what they wanted to do was to really take a fact-based approach to make sure that the strategies they were deploying were comparable with companies in the consumer packaged goods sector, as well as some of the lead steers. And this was not just for the managed service portion, but they were also trying to make sure that there's app dev, DevOps into the mix. So what did we observe as we did this? Their baselines were completely short. They had no real good ways to get the data, which became an interesting exercise in itself. Significantly higher cost profile focused on apps run versus apps build. So they were misaligned and therefore lagging the market. There was massive amounts of fragmentation in the supply portfolio. And then that was therefore slowing them down when it comes to innovation and execution. And there was business IT coming in. So, there was a bigger shadow IT thesis coming in. So as we looked at that, ran the benchmarks, there were recommendations that came in to redefine the org model. So how do you really tackle silos to create a more global product-oriented DevOps structure? How do you really get to a 2-supplier model or a 3-supplier model, build out the skills inventory, and then keep funding the IT innovation? And oh, by the way, as we got to the end of this transaction, based on the consideration, they were able to achieve in-year savings of 30%, right? So yes, we've got the benchmarks, but as we've also looked at applying these with the necessary recommendations, there's some real money to be saved and unlocked as we look at the work that was delivered.
So Jimit, on this one, what was the overall time frame they were looking at? So you mentioned a number there for the in-year savings, but what was the overall project on this time box as?
So from start to finish, it took about 8 months, right? But this included a pretty significant RFP effort to figure out how you would take the scope of work from the 100 suppliers to 2.
Okay.
Within 8 months, so started Q1, by end of Q3, we were ready to sign.
Fantastic. Okay, let's bring this to our summary here in terms of our key considerations. Jimit, wrap us up here.
Sure. So we promised we talk through our best ideas on cost savings, right? So we gave you some of those. I know a few of you said you wanted to have discussions with this. So if you want breakthrough savings, you need to have a rethink of the fundamental budgeting assumptions and operating model choices, right? So without that, you're just going to get incremental savings. Might not be a bad thing, but breakthrough savings are possible with some changes. Getting that clear visibility into the IT estate is important. And then flexible funding and budgeting strategies are important, right? The total cost of ownership impacts are amplified if you combine multiple levers simultaneously, right? So you could go after each of these as individual initiatives, but the sum of parts is bigger than the individuals. We have a belief that third parties can be strategically leveraged to accelerate and expand savings, but they need different contracting vehicles. There's a lot of budgets out there with the large SIs, with the large hyperscalers to enable financial engineering, and that's helped some of our clients here. And then finally, we talk about shift left, running lean when it comes to technology. There's also a pretty significant shift underway to shift right on talent, which is to make sure you have the right size teams, the right shape of the pyramids, and the right skilled workforce to really use those savings that you're driving to achieve the business outcomes that you need. So those were the 5 key breakthrough ideas or 5 summary messages that we had. And I know there's some questions, so we can start to dive into those.
Yeah, Jimit, before we go to those questions, I mean, the most obvious thing that I took away from this webinar was, while the budgets were up at the surface level were nearly flat, a massive amount of change going on within the IT business. And I think that's the part that you could easily overlook if you were just kind of looking at the first few slides. But I also know that the businesses themselves are going, it's life or death for some of these businesses if they don't make the business model changes, because, you think about, we knew about Amazon out there for a long, long time coming. We knew it was there. And then all of a sudden now it's having real impact, not even just before the pandemic on the bricks and mortar retail. But that's not, this whole digital transformation, this whole change in the customer experience is not limited to just bricks and mortar. It's affecting healthcare. It's affecting the financial services industry in ways that are almost hard to imagine. So I keep thinking, hey, surface is calm, things are moving here. And I can't see how an organization can ignore some of the things you're talking about.
Absolutely. And go back to those first 2 priorities, right? Budgets was priority number 1 that people were tackling. Enabling the workforce was priority number 2, right? Priority number 2 costs real money. And people need to find the talent to invest to drive the build activities. And I think that's where we see this duality of efforts, which is really driving a lot of excitement in the marketplace.
Yeah. Okay, so let's open it up to questions and answers. And we've got a couple questions here we'll pose. If you have any other questions you want to ask, go ahead and put those into the Q&A panel on the platform. All right, so Jimit, I'm going to go this one to you. Does the reduction in the infrastructure tower space to increase spend in application build resonate with the enterprise strategy? I.e., the applications features goes at a faster pace than it can manage, might be a potential for disaster. What do you think?
Yes, I don't necessarily see this as being mutually exclusive, right? And which is why there's on the infrastructure side. So let's unpack that for a second, right? People are recognizing what they don't need is massive amounts of data center investments anymore. They recognize that a lot of the infrastructure can be software defined, and therefore the resources that you put into managing the legacy estate shrinks as you move to the cloud, right? So I think that the whole cloud economics thesis has been proven out for a while, and that's why we're saying that there's savings to be had if you haven't made the transition away from a legacy environment or a hosted environment to an infrastructure environment. At the same time, on the application space as well, there's a lot of modernization and people are moving away from custom bespoke applications to more standard applications in the cloud, commercial off the shelf, which starts to reduce the risk of the application feature, right? Does it have to be managed? Oh, absolutely. But I think people are trying to deal with it by saying, let's take closer to out of the box functionality. Let's take closer to configurations versus customizations. And that then starts to reduce some of the risk, not eliminate the feature creep that you might have with the infrastructure and applications estate not try to talk to each other. It's not straightforward. It's not easy, but looking at both of these in conjunction is important. And we validated this through a variety of benchmarks to make sure that's what's happening.
Okay, we have time for one more question here. For the onshore leverage that we talked about on slide 20, what are you seeing today in the industry as a typical onshore offshore mix, and what are you recommending to companies the ideal state in given the remote workforce working in the agile mode today? Yeah, so that's the number you and I were kind of alluding to. What are some of the numbers you're hearing about?
Yeah, so I think the answer again is it's important to think of the answers separately for build versus run, right? So if you're looking at onshore offshore for build activities, I think that what we've seen inch upwards is from a 70-30 approach to more of an 80-20, 85-15, right? 85 offshore, 15 onshore. This is for build activities. When it comes to the run activities, right? There are extreme examples where people say, hey, 95 is the new 80, right? So 95% offshore, 5% onshore. And even then, the onshore doesn't have to be co-located. I think the rule of thumb, if I had to step back and think, is there's no real target metric, but every organization we are speaking to is looking to up their offshore leverage by 10 percentage points, right? So if you were at 75, the next target is 85. If you're at 50, you have a lot more catch up to do, but I think plus 10 seems to be the general direction in the marketplace today.
All right, Jimit, thank you, and I'll reiterate the offer. I think you'll have a chance in the as the session closes down to ask the question. If you'd like to get a conversation with Ashwin on the benchmark data about IT services, and I think that's a pretty hard number in the industry to get a read on because it's not generally available. But if you want to talk to Ashwin and his team about that, and you're an enterprise, go ahead and check that box, and we'll make sure we get a conversation with you going. All right, with that, we're going to conclude the webinar. We have a lot of information up on the web. We are extremely data driven, and we have a lot of content around that. You can check out our blogs on the webinar or on the website, and then also we have a lot of content that'll be related to this, and then you can always just reach out to us personally. So appreciate your time today. These are interesting times. And I'm going to go with the optimism for the second half of the year. And just so you know, I booked a trip to Hawaii in November. So I'm planning to get back in the hopefully into the travel world, which has been largely devoid in my life. So I'm hoping you guys are thinking that same way, and have a great time. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you to Michael, Jimit, and Ashwin, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, you'll receive a follow-up email within 1 to 2 business days with a link to download the presentation slides, along with accessing the on-demand playback of today's live session. On behalf of Everest Group and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.